So we're speaking with Jahan Marcu. Jahan is the scientific advisor to Project CBD. He's received his Ph.D. from Temple University, where he did his dissertation on the structure and activity of cannabinoid receptors. You've also been involved in certain very important scientific papers documenting the anti-cancer activity of compounds in cannabis. You're also the chief scientist for Americans for Safe Access. You're the chief auditor for the patient-focused certification program of Americans for Safe Access. We'll be talking about that a little bit. You've also served on various committees of trade associations and science organizations, including the American Chemical Society, the International Association for Cannabis as Medicine, and also the American Herbal Products Association. Thank you for being with us, Jahan. I wanted to ask you initially about cannabis and safety protocols. I mean, for those who aren't wearing reefer madness blinders, I think they would, there's a wide recognition that cannabis is a safe substance. Francis Young, a former DEA administrative law, a chief law officer, actually referred to it in a legal document as cannabis being safer than many foods, many common foods that we eat. If it's so safe, why is it important that in the industry today that there be regulations and standards for safety?
It's a good question, and I think the most basic answer is that those are the rules. In this country, if you sell products that people are going to consume, they need to be tested for safety. Those are the simple rules of what it boils down to.
And so what does that mean in terms of setting standards of safety? What is a standard in this case?
So, standards usually begin as a best practice. A group such as the American Herbal Products Association, or APA, several years ago started these working committees where members of industry, various stakeholders, laboratory operators, patient advocates got together and discussed standards. What makes a good manufacturer? What makes a good cultivator? What makes a good dispensary? What makes a good laboratory? Probably the most important aspect of medical cannabis standards. And so these best practices get adopted. And as we've seen with the APA standards, they have been adopted by 11 states along with the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia standards. And so what would you call the same legislation being adopted over and over again? Those are standards. And they set standards such as how much metal and lead you're allowed to have in your products, or how much fungus or pesticide you're allowed. Similar standards that what you'd expect when you buy a salad at a grocery store, or you buy a pack of vitamin C or some sort of plant extract from anywhere. You would expect a certain level of safety, and that it was intended for human consumption. It wasn't intended to feed animals. It wasn't intended to make a shirt out of it or put some sort of oil in your car. It was intended for human consumption. I think also there's a confusion too in what quality means to some people. Quality, it refers to purity, and we have to remember that quality is also a term that's used to describe things like motor oil and poison. And there are high quality of everything, but we have to understand what we mean when we say purity, consistency. And as medical cannabis products are rolling out and people are using them, a lot of medical cannabis users are looking for something that's going to repeat, it's going to be consistent. And that's where we will see the new studies coming through. You know, there are 6,000 plus rare diseases that exist where there's no treatment for them. And if we ever hope to develop treatments for them, we better have standardized medicine that can be used for long-term investigations. And those only come from having standards. And that's just one avenue of what standards can do for an industry, is to help create long-term clinical trials such as the ones that aren't currently available.
So with cannabis, though, we're dealing with a substance, an herb, that is federally illegal. So how do you establish standards that are going to be applicable nationally when it's only in certain states that cannabis is legal as a medicine, or just a few number of states that it's illegal for adult use? What are the challenges in terms of developing standards and implementing them in this context?
That's a great question. So the reason the American Herbal Products Association, other standards groups have gotten involved is because they are not controlled by the DEA. You're allowed to create, it's not the first time ever that a substance from a plant has been discovered and made into a legal medicine. It's happened, for instance, you might remember there's a plant called the poppy plant, and opium and morphine and these things, and we discovered another endogenous system by investigating that plant. And there have been rules and standards for that. But there's really, what's interesting is that some organizations are prevented from issuing standards. So the USP, the United States Pharmacopoeia, is not a government organization, but when it issues monographs, it gives pharmacists certain abilities. For instance, allows them to compound with a substance. Well, the USP may not be able to release a formal monograph until cannabis is rescheduled because they would be out of compliance with their DEA standards. However, a group like the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia doesn't have to worry about DEA compliance. A group like AOAC or other groups that are developing analytical standards do not have to work directly with the DEA. They might come to them for help with forensic testing and other issues, but we're going to see standards. We would hope that the USP would come up with a standard to be adopted by all states and everything would be great and solved overnight. But the reality is that's going to be a slow process, and we need, in the monograph and the APA standards provide a foundation for the industry for consistency.
And by APA, you're referring to American Herbal Products Association. And maybe tell us a little bit about the monograph that you were actually involved with others in composing.
So there's the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia has put out about 28 monographs, I believe, on various plants. This is standards for identifying it and cultivating it and producing it to meet botanical medicine standards, as well as guides on dosing and administration. And the reason, most people can readily identify cannabis, but there are a lot of plants that look like it, like the Japanese maple, for instance, and several other members of the Cannabiceae family all have a very similar leaf structure. So just a conceptual example, you need a standard method for how you identify it, both by looking at it and by doing chemical analysis. And that's in the monograph. The monograph has testing standards, testing limits such as residual solvents, identified methods for identifying pesticides, fungal bacteria limits. And these, while some people criticize any regulatory document, I think you have to remember that there was probably close to 100 people involved in writing this. And there's an old saying, if 100 people say that this is the way to do it, they might be onto something, especially since the people who worked on it came from all different disciplines and they were all experts. And for instance, this monograph was undertaken by Ethan Russo, Mahmoud El-Soli, Raphael Meshulam, Appendino, and the list gets a little more esoteric, but we're talking about people who've worked with the FDA, people who've worked with the USDA, reviewing, editing, all contributing to creation of this document.
You're talking about some of the leading lights in the scientific community.
Yeah, including one of the final reviewers of the monograph, which contains information about individual cannabinoids and their effects, is currently the most published pharmacologist in the world, Vincenzo De Marzo. He has some over 500 publications on endocannabinoids and cannabinoids alone.
Well, let's talk a little bit about when you say testing. This is going to come down to the reliability of the lab that's doing the testing. And you, through your work with the patient-focused certification program of Americans for Safe Access, you've been involved in auditing these labs and so forth. What do you see out there in terms of the labs that are servicing the cannabis community in terms of consistency? Is there a long way to go? Are we doing a good job in that respect? What do you find in your work when you are auditing these labs?
Some of the labs are absolutely ready to be regulated. Some of the labs also have inspections from state agencies, like Washington State. They already have some inspectors coming in, fire department and such. And however, I think the biggest challenge for some operators in general is just getting their staff ready for a regulatory inspection. It's different than interacting with law enforcement. It's different than interacting perhaps with other municipalities. So I think being ready for an auditor to show up at your place and go through your books, I think it's a new concept for some people.
Well, it implies a certain level of professionalism that may not have been there at the beginning of the whole experience with labs servicing the cannabis industry.
Well, I think what first has to happen is the labs need to get on board with best practices. Some labs have done a great job in observing this. Other labs, for instance, don't want to create their own standards, and they don't realize that, the monograph was a 9-year project and involved several phases. Standards aren't going to be created overnight. I mean, it's going to take a long time, 5 to 10 years for any organization to even release Method 1 right now. And so I think in order for things to be scientifically valid, things to be consistent, laboratories have to get on board with agreeing on some set of standards. It's a historical moment. Once, this is a scientific problem right now that is in the process of being solved by medical cannabis laboratories, but it represents, policy, regulation, breakthroughs in analytical chemistry, and it's even, anthropological. And it's a historic moment right now. As we're going to look back on this later and be really surprised with how far our labs have gone with testing cannabis and what they can do.
Well, there's a ISO certified labs. What does ISO stand for? And is that a kind of a certification that is kind of top of the line, or is that sort of your base level that has to be there for a lab to be operating well? How does that criteria fit in? Because that's an international thing.
Yeah, ISO is an international standards, and the A2LA is an organization that trains a lot of those assessors who go in and look at ISO to see if a place is ISO compliant. And they have different regulations. There's ISO 17025 is for analytical laboratories, but they have also general management systems like ISO 9000, which a hotel can be, or a police station, for managing their paperwork a certain way. And it's important. It includes, for instance, ISO requires there to be, for a lab, to be validated methods being used. That staff, but however, it doesn't necessarily cover training or tell you whether or not your operation is legally operating within its jurisdiction for cannabis. And so there are a lot of standards out there. Some are better than others, some address more than others, and some have a different scope. And so, for instance, for patient-focused certification, we also look at method validation. Having an ISO compliance or being accredited will definitely help you pass a PFC audit, because it will make the review of the data methodology much easier. You'll have updated standard operating procedures. But I also look at training records, we look at licensing, we look at zoning, we look at how you dispose of your waste, we look at methods that aren't validated but that you're also using on site. We kind of look at everything. You also look at batch tracking and adverse events reporting, making sure that you know who extracted what and what did it go into and where did it go, so that if there's an issue, the product can be tracked or recalled.
Well, you mentioned issues. Let's talk about some of the issues, because one of the jobs of a lab, you would think, would be to report adverse findings, adverse events when they come upon them. Project CBD has caught a lot of flack when we reported that in certain CBD-rich products there were solvent residues that shouldn't have been there. What is how do you relate to this adverse event reporting? Is that something the industry should be embracing? Should we be shunning that? I mean, it doesn't necessarily cast an industry in the best light, and yet it's important.
I would gently disagree. I think that any operation that engages in a recall plan is engaging in product safety. Any company that is following up on adverse events claim and making a determination about whether or not that product should be recalled, or an advisory should be issued, or perhaps labeling should be changed. These are public health issues, and I think it's important that we not chastise companies for engaging in this recall. Let me give you, and then also labs are not the gatekeepers of adverse events. It is the producers of these products, the distributors of these products, are the ones who should be having an adverse events program. And we should praise those companies that engage in this, because they're not always wrong. their products are not always tainted. And we can give you that while there are recalls happening, it seems like every week we hear about them in Colorado, but it's not publicized very heavily or discussed are the products that are released after they're deemed clear because the lab wasn't using a validated method and condemned these products when they were safe. But it's best to see this program working. It brings a lot more legitimacy, a lot more of a scientific foundation to what we're doing when, adverse events should not be shied away from. There should be an open discussion about them. There should be a national repository where operators in this industry can review them and look into them. The community needs to be its own FDA in this regard and for many other things. For the most part, states right now do not have the capacity to act like an FDA for the industry. OSHA has enough issues, work safety inspections, but they will get around to the cannabis industry sooner or later. And I think we have to be prepared. We have to be our own FDA. We have to be vigilant. And we've seen a lot of other products come off the market due to a lack of pharmacovigilance. It is keeping track of adverse events and addressing them. And a lot of times people will say, well, it's adverse events. We can't really prove that cannabis caused it, just that the products were there, at the scene. And I think that that's even something that needs to be reviewed and tracked as well.
You mentioned the FDA. I remember Dr. Todd McArea referred to the FDA as the fully discredited administration. What role, if any, should the FDA be playing in this situation? Because they've recently issued letters, pretty much it's like slapdown of CBD hemp oil companies for mislabeling or making false claims and so forth. Does the federal the Food and Drug Administration, the Federal Food and Drug Administration, have a role to play that's valid in this context?
They are playing a role right now, as you said, with these FDA letters. They're looking at labeling of products. They are not the DEA, though. Right? They don't have officers that come in and arrest you per se, but they do have officers or representatives who will show up to your laboratory or manufacturing site and fine you for every little thing. Lack of approved standard operating procedures, a lack of secure hardware and software, uncalibrated equipment. There are 483 violations. And so right now we're just hearing about labeling violations. And I think that soon they may actually show up to facilities, in our lifetime definitely, and issue citations. And I think this is what they do sometimes to laboratories, is they will show up with a van and fine you per day until you fix the corrective actions or go out of business.
There's another kind of adverse event at play here, in that irrespective of the quality of the product that a person might consume, there are a certain percentage of people that may have a bad experience and that perhaps shouldn't be exposing themselves to cannabis. I think the number that's typically bandied about by federal agencies is like 9% will develop a cannabis abuse. I think that's way high in terms of the number. But what about those very small percentage of people who are being exposed to something that might prove difficult to them? How does that play out in terms of the concerns that you address?
So the research that is based upon is very difficult because it contains no standardized products. These are interviews with people where they derive this information. And that 9% figure of the number of people who develop cannabis use disorder or dependence, more than half of those, more than 50% of that number is generated from court-ordered drug treatment due to possession or something like that. So the number may be around 5% or less. We may eventually find out. But studies with cannabis medicines, such as FDA-approved Marinol, which is oral THC dissolved in sesame oil, and Sativex, the hash oil extract that's dissolved in ethanol, those have been studied very intensively, and they both have extremely low abuse potential. They have virtually no black market value. And these are standardized preparations that if you were to measure, let's just talk about pain, and you were to measure, say, every patient in a study and say, well, if you had a 12-week study involving 5 patients, that would be 60 weeks. If you added up all the patient years, you'd have about 6,000 patient years of data from patients using Sativex and Marinol and other standardized preparations of cannabis to look at pain. And they have looked at adverse event profiling. They've looked at withdrawal. They've looked at abuse potential. And it's very low with standardized preparations. When you don't know what you're getting, when the dose can be high, low, medium, the active constituents can vary from day to day, I think that is the biggest issue right now when it comes to adverse events, is that the predictability and guidance on how to use these products.
Well, Marinol and Sativex, you mentioned. Marinol is an actually approved pharmaceutical. One can access it's a pure THC product with the doctor's prescription. Sativex is actually in phase 3 clinical trials now for cancer pain in the United States. It's an approved medication in many different countries. Essentially, it's a 1-to-1 CBD to THC tincture. Well, the obvious benefits for standardizing these medicines are significant. One can take something that they know what it is and be assured that they can repeat that if it's helping them. But I think there's another edge to these kinds of medications that are approved on a federal level. It raises the question, what will happen to the medical experiment that's been unfolding at the grassroots in California and other states that have medical marijuana laws? What will the fate of the great laboratory experiment in democracy that's been unfolding in medical marijuana states in light of the move toward legalizing for adult use recreationally? If you can gaze into the crystal ball and see what do you think is going to happen in the future with respect to medical marijuana as opposed to big pharma or utilizing individual cannabinoids as medicine?
Well, I think the first thing that has to happen is rescheduling. And rescheduling of cannabis, even to Schedule II, will not give the pharmaceutical companies a big incentive to get involved. I think we're really far away from the total pharmaceuticalization of cannabis. But what perhaps rescheduling would do to cannabis is allow laboratories to access the standards they need, allow groups like the AOAC and other analytical standards group to develop certified reference standards for interlaboratory tests across state lines. Schedule II DEA licenses are much easier to get than Schedule I licenses, and I think we would only strengthen the industry, we'd only strengthen the safety of cannabis patients if cannabis was Schedule II and laboratories, manufacturers are actually able to engage in more thorough quality control without being unfairly handicapped by its Schedule I status.
Do you think Schedule II goes far enough in the end?
It's a good step, and I think it's far enough to make waves internationally. And I think what we will experience is not that a single country will change the law, but that it'll happen at the international level. And I think we're on the precipice of having some really interesting discussions around the UNDOC table or around the various United Nations groups that discuss drugs and psychoactive substances.
Well, I think this has been an interesting discussion. I thank you for your participation. Jahan Marcu, good luck.
Thank you.